This is an introduction to the Cloner Fuse, which is a motion graphics tool for use in DaVinci Resolve, Fusion, and Fusion Standalone. It's basically a tool that clones things. But then once they're cloned, you can do various things to animate them, and it's very useful for motion graphics. It came about because I needed to duplicate some items, and although there is a built-in duplicator in DaVinci Resolve, which is like a replicator in After Effects, it was a bit limited, and so I ended up creating this tool. It's a fuse, which is sort of like an extended script. It's free. It's currently in beta, and hopefully will eventually be in Reactor, which is subject for a completely different tutorial, but basically it's a way of installing things in Fusion. The Cloner Fuse works with the free and studio version of DaVinci Resolve, and as far as I'm aware, works with all versions of Fusion Standalone. To get it, you need to go to this thread on WeSuckLess or stakeunderwater.com, which is a forum for users of Fusion. It's very helpful. I couldn't have created this without the help of various people on there, particularly Brian Ray, who helped me with some of the code. Currently, the way to get it, the latest version, is to scroll to the end of the thread and you will find a download link just here. To install it, you need to put it in the Fuses folder, and the paths to those should be appearing on screen now. I believe these are correct for Windows and Mac. I'm not sure what they are on Linux, but I'm assuming if you're using the Linux version, you can find the Fuses folder. Once you've installed the Fuse and restart it, you can access it in multiple ways. You can right-click and go Add Tool, Creator, Cloner, or Effects Library, Creator, Cloner, drag it from there. Or the simplest way is Shift Spacebar, type CLO, and have Cloner. What Cloner does is clones things. So to clone something, you need an input. So in this case, we'll go with background, make it white. And because we're going to make multiple copies of this, I'm going to change the resolution from default to 100 by 100. And let's have a look at that in view 1. There we have a square. Now you might think that to clone this, you select the background and then add the cloner. But because of a technical reason, that doesn't work. Because of the type of tool it's classed as, I'm working on a way around this, but currently it's best to not have anything selected and then add the cloner. And then you can disconnect that in and look at number 2 in viewer 2, and we have the cloner. So there are multiple modes you can use the cloner. We have a grid, which is, as you'd expect, a grid of clones. We've got linear, which is a line between 2 points. You can either control the points here or by using these handles. And of course, everything can be animated. Radial, which is obviously a circle. Image, which we'll come back to in a minute. And Bezier, which is a simple Bezier curve. Let's go back to grid. Now in the tools in the grid, you've got obviously the grid count, X and Y, the grid size, which is 0 to 1, as in everything in Fusion. And then you've got right on X and right on Y, and this is literally just offsetting them one into the other. Then you have the offset, which just offsets the grid from its start position. And there's a checkbox here, which is loop grid offset. And what that does, if you see currently when I turn that, it just moves completely off. If I turn that on, it sort of loops back around. So it goes off one edge and comes on the other. But it makes more sense if I use the right on. You can see that in action. And linear, as I said, you've got a number of clones, positions which can be moved around. And again, you've got a right on and right off. And an offset, which in this case always loops. Radial, you've got pretty much the same sort of controls, a number, a right on and right off. You can make it an ellipse rather than a straight circle if you wish. As at the offset, which just moves those around. Again, if I do that, it makes it more obvious. And you can make it clockwise, which is about the order the clones go in. Anti-clockwise, starting from sort of there, or clockwise, starting from there. I'll jump to Bezier again. The Bezier, you've got, as I said, basically the same controls. And again, he uses a right on, right off. Cloning to an image is a special case. It uses the alpha channel. To demonstrate this, I'm just going to grab a text node. Let's have a look at that. See, make it slightly bigger. And to actually tell Cloner to use this as the image to clone to, you right click, hover over, let go, and go image to clone to. And if you see it's cloned, obviously that background's quite big, so I'm going to make the background a lot smaller, just so you can see, 20 by 20. And then in the controls, you've got resolution, which is how fine a resolution to use. To demonstrate this further, if I just grab this picture, which is the desktop picture from Mojave, sand dune, if I take that, right click, image to clone to, you see it doesn't really do anything interesting, it's just as if it was a grid, because the alpha channel of this is completely white, as you can see by hitting A. So what I need to do is grab a bitmap, connect that to that. Let's look at that. Change to luminance. Just clamp the blacks and push the whites like that. And now when I drag that in, image to clone to, you see it's added clones based on this alpha channel, which is what use is. And if I just grab a mask, you can sort of see multiple clones based on the alpha channel. Continuing on, let's look at some of the other controls. Switch this to linear and give myself some clones. Axis is the position of the whole cloner. It's not that useful a control when it's there. Now the size, this is increase per clone. So if I do that, you see this clone would be 1.19 bigger than this one will be 1.19 bigger than that one, and so on and so on. So it's a sort of cumulative effect. And the same with the sort of reverse. And if I increase the number of clones, you see you can increase and decrease them. It works the same on the radial. With the grid, it's slightly different because of the way it's calculated. If I increase the size slightly, you'll notice that this one is the same as that one. It's because it's using mathematical position within the grid. If I increase them, you'll see that this one is the same as that one's the same as that one, that one's the same as that one, and so on. The angle, which is a similar cumulative effect, so one clone is 20 degrees, the next one's 40, and so on and so on. The same applies. The linear, you can see there you can animate this and all the clones rotate but at different rates because the angle is accumulating. Moving on, looking at apply modes. These are the usual things you find in compositing. Probably not a good thing to show with just a white square, so I'm going to take our sand dune, add a transform, scale it down, put that in as the clone. You can see we've got them cloned. Let's increase the size very slightly, and then you've got screen, soft light, hard light, etc. Most of which are useless, but there is a case for using them, possibly. Subtractive additive is the same sort of thing to do with compositing. I haven't found a particular use for it, but if I put the square back and then change it to subtractive, you see that it look like they're on top of each other. I'm sure there's a better compositing reason for doing this, but I don't know what it is. Gain, this again is a cumulative effect, affecting each clone based on the previous one. There are possibilities of using that to create color effects, although, as you'll see later, there are much better ways. Burn in, this again, is a compositing thing, and blend is sort of the fade from one to the next, to the next, to the next. Although you can get some quite nice effects if I make this radial, put the blend, make the, and then maybe the offset, you can get interesting effects. Before I move on to the next tab, which is the jitter tab or random tab, I'm just going to increase the number of clones slightly and the size of the grid just to make it more apparent what's happening. So this is the random tab. Ignore the center that does nothing. The axis is a sort of random position. If I just hit the random seed, you see it moves those all around. Size again, sort of random, increasing of size. And the same with the angle. This randomness also affects the colors. You can have random colors. Again, there is a better way of controlling colors. There are possible uses of all this. To emphasize a point that Cloner can clone anything that Fusion can handle. So if I just increase the number of clones, take the background, add an ellipse, move it up, put a keyframe, and animate this. Cloner has cloned the whole animation. And obviously, number of clones. Let's, for example, make it that many. Radial. And then if I take the animation of this ellipse, bring up the spline editor, give everything some easing, and then ping pong it. So now the animation is bouncing back and forth. We see that Cloner has cloned the whole animation. And this is where it starts getting interesting. If you start playing around with the time offset, this is how many frames each clone is in relation to the previous one. So -5 frames, +5 frames. Obviously, this number can be bigger, say 15. And you notice that these clones disappearing. That's because they're 15 frames ahead, and each of these clones only exist from 0 to 259, which is what the length of this fusion composition. If you want to make sure that doesn't happen, you just need to increase the lifespan of whatever you're cloning so it's much longer than the animation you need. And obviously the same is true if you go negative. To stop them just popping onto screen, which may be an effect you want. Again, you can make the clones exist from a negative frame. And of course, all the usual controls are still there. Which means you can get some interesting motion graphic effects by just animating whatever you're cloning and then offsetting it in time. And of course, because the axis of the clone is based on, in this case, it's a background which is square, you can get some interesting effects using that. Cloning anything by grabbing a piece of stock footage, which is just a street scene. Let's make it slightly smaller by adding a transform. Make that the thing that cloner's cloning. See, we've got videos cloned 4 times. Obviously, have as many clones of the video as you want. And then you can get some interesting effects. And again, if we play around with the time offset, bearing in mind that we've got 64 copies of this video, so it's taking a little time to sort itself out. But you can get some interesting effects by just cloning a video. And again, if you played with the blend modes, let's put that screen, who knows what wonders you could do with this effect. Moving on to the image tab, we're skipping this tab for the moment. This is how big the cloner is. By default, it'll choose whatever your composition is set for, but of course you can change it. But be aware that these numbers are based on the cloner's size. So if I make that 1 and then adjust the cloner size, you see what happened. Settings tab, ignore the masks, they don't work properly. Motion blur is of course what you'd expect and the usual things you get in any Fusion tool. Now we'll move on to this tab, which is the Effectors tab. Effectors are images that affect the behavior of each clone. To demonstrate this, I'll just create a background. Put it in the left viewer, make it white, add a rectangle mask, and just soften the edge. In Cloner, I will increase the number of clones so it's more obvious what it's doing. And then to make this background image an effector, you again right-click over the cloner and choose whichever effector you want it to be. In this case, I'll use the position effector. Then come into the Effectors tab, say Use Position Effector, and now this is determining what effect the effector is having on the clones. So if I move this background about, you can see the effect it is having on the position of each of the clones. And of course, this can be animated. To illustrate that, I'll grab a fast noise, increase the contrast, the seethe rate, so actually increase the seethe rate even more, so you can see that the fast noise is animated. Again, right click, hover over, let go, position effector, and if we hit play, you can see that the clones are reacting their position to the animated effector. X and Y position, of course, can be controlled completely independently. By default, they use the Luma channel of the effector, but this, of course, can be changed. If I do this, currently nothing will happen much because the image is black and white. If I go to the fast noise and make one color red and the other color blue, depending which channels I select, we get different effects. The next option, which is Use Position Midpoint, this affects the way the position is changed. To demonstrate this, I'm going to switch this to a linear, increase the number of clones, make it slightly longer. Go to the Effectors tab. I'm just going to affect the Y position. Just to see what it's doing. I'm going to put this back to how it was. If I hit play, you can see each clone starts in the center and then is going up and down, but never going below the center. If I then use position midpoint, anything that is above middle grey is a positive effect. Anything below middle grey is a negative effect, as you can see here. So when it's white, it goes up. When it's black, it goes down. And in between, in the sort of middle grey, it does nothing. And of course, this affects every mode. And of course, all the other effects still work. Put it back to linear again. And again, to demonstrate what this is doing, if I turn off Use Position Midpoint, the clones are just going up, whereas in this case they're going up and down. So you can control which direction the clones move based on the level. In this case it's Luma, but it could be a middle red, a mid green, a mid blue. To show the position effector a bit more, I'm going to take the background I created, remove the mask, switch it to gradient, mode to ping pong, and this allows me to move the gradient. And to animate it, I'm just going to add a small expression, which is going to change the offset over time. So as you see now, we have the gradient moving, but it is not affecting this at the moment because currently it's the fast noise, it is the position effector. But again, right click, hover over position effector, and you can see the effect of the position effector on this series of clones. And of course, if I change the type to, for example, radial, you can see the effect. Think of effectors as a way of procedurally animating whatever it is you're cloning. If I change this back to linear for a moment, turn off use position midpoint. Ignore that jump, that's just because the composition is looping. Turn that off. If I then take the background and go to the white and then fade that down, I've faded the effect of the effector, if you see what I mean. So that is another way of controlling whatever it is you're animating with your effectors. And of course, effector images can be anything. This could be a piece of video, or you can blend together things in Fusion. We have our animated noise. If we merge that on top, look at that, change the mode to, for example, difference. That is having a different effect than just the background on its own. So that's the position effector. I'm just going to disconnect the image for the moment. I don't have to. I can just, if I undo that, I can stop the effector by just turning off that option, and now that's no longer affecting position. I'm going to take the background and again right click, this time scale effector, turn on the scale effector, and to make it look nice I'm going to add an expression. I'm just going to pick whip that. So this means that the X and Y scales are linked. If I then increase that, you can see the effect the effector is having on the scale. And again, you've got the channels if you wish to use different channels to control X and Y scale. And the scale midpoint does a similar thing where heading towards black is a negative, heading towards white is a positive. And if I turn off scale midpoint for a moment, make the scale -1, the effect of white is to scale this to nothing. So that's the scale effector. Again, I'm going to turn it off for a moment. The next effector we're going to look at is the rotation effector. Obviously, rotating a circle, you wouldn't see anything. So I'm going to remove the ellipse mask, so we just have a square. And again, to make it slightly more obvious, I'm going to make the width half of the height. Again, I'm going to right-click, rotation effector, turn on the use rotation effector. Again, we're using the Luma channel in default, although you can use any channel. And give it some rotation. And you can see the effect it is having. And again, there's a rotation midpoint, which does the same thing. The negative towards black, positive towards white, mid-grade does little. And of course, as I said before, it is affecting everything. To demonstrate what this effector axis is doing, which affects everything, but is more obvious what it's doing when you're playing around with scale and rotation. Because by default, the axis for the scale and the rotation is in the center at 0.5, 0.5. But this can be changed. So if I make that 0, you've seen it now that the clone is scaling from the bottom and rotating around the bottom. And you can even move the effector axis outside of the clone itself. If I turn on the position effector, you'll notice that it has shifted the position based on that axis. And if I just switch this to a grid, you can see what it is doing. Moving on, I'm going to change this background, the thing we're cloning, to be a square. And disable all the other effectors. And I'm just going to reduce the number in the Y to 4. Okay. Now, as I said, Cloner clones anything, so I want to create an animation. So what we have is a looping animation of a circle. We now move on to the next effector, which is the time effector. And for this, I'm going to demonstrate with our fast noise. But in this case, I'm going to turn the seethe rate down, so it's not animated. And then right-click, time effector, go to the effector settings, and as before, we've got an offset. So the time offset is dependent on the value, in this case luminance, of this background. And if I hit play, you see that each of these is animating, but they're offset in time based on the luminance of this background. So that's the time effector. I'm going to disable that for the moment, and we'll move on to the final effector, which is the color effector. This is a way of coloring whatever it is you're cloning. I'll grab a plasma, which looks like that. Put that in as the color effector. Move to the effector, turn it on. As you see, each clone has taken on the color beneath it. If I just merge this on top of the plasma, look at that. Bearing in mind that the color is taken from the center, and of course it's still using the animation, is still there. That was that. If I take our sand dune picture, change that, the color effector, it's now taken on the color of this image. In fact, if I make this ellipse solid again, you can see if I go to the cloner and increase the number of grid points, you can get more of a picture of how it's looking. And of course, this could be a video. So again, we've got our street scene. You can see the red trousers as the person walks across. Here comes the yellow taxi, which is there. An important thing to understand is the order the effectors work. Although they're in this particular order, they actually go in the opposite direction. So the color effector is the first one. So even though, if we're going to use the position effector, this has moved the clones up. They're taking the color from before they were moved up with the position effector. And in fact, all the operations in the first tab are done first as well. So for example, if I take the offset, you see the colors change because, in fact, if I turn off the position effector, it will be more obvious. In fact, if I stop the animation, you notice that the position here determines the color. It's just something to be aware of, the order of operations. The cloner will also take the alpha of whatever you're using as a color effector. So our background, currently it's black and white. So if we make this the color effector, in fact, Let me just remove that ellipse mask and reduce the number of clones. And make this background the color effector. You see currently, because this is as a solid alpha, it goes from black and white. But on this background, this gradient, if I choose the black and then make the alpha you see they fade out. So you can control the visibility of clones using the alpha channel of a color effector. If you have been paying attention, you'll notice there's one option I've skipped over, which is on this first panel, solo clones. Demonstrate that, and come to this cloner. I'm just going to turn off the effectors, make it linear, and maybe make the background slightly smaller. So currently we just have a line of squares. If I go into the first panel and hit solo clones, they all disappear. But that's clone 1, that's clone 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are 9 clones. So let's say we want to just show clone 5. Go solo clones, type in 5. I want to show another one, comma 9. So now we have just those clones shown, or those clones are hidden. But why we want to do this, there are very specific cases. If I take this cloner, I copy it, and rather than just paste it, I paste an instance of it, which basically means it's exactly the same thing, except currently there's nothing being cloned into it. I then take this background, copy that, paste it, give it an ellipse mask. So now we have a circle. We then clone that. So we have 2 cloners which are identical, apart from the shape they're cloning is different. On this second one, I'm going to de-instance the hide selected. So this is now separate from the original cloner. Hide selected. And now you see this one has clones there. This one has clones there. And if I grab my background, position effector, and then it doesn't matter which one because this isn't de-instance, use the position effector, you see those have been being positioned by the effector, and so are those. And if we merge them together, you see that they're both using the same procedural animation, but the shapes are different. And you could have as many of these as you wanted. There'd be different shapes, different animations, but they would all use the same effectors. So if you have a certain animation that you like, you can use the solo clones method to create variation. And if I just go back here, and let's add in clone 1 by comma 1. Now you see we have circles and squares doing exactly the same animation. On a linear cloner, the clone numbers are pretty obvious, but on a grid cloner, how do you know the numbers? Well, in this case, starts here at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 5, 9, and 1. Obviously, if you increase the number of clones, those are going to change. But the principle is the same. You can do this with every method, although if you did it with an image cloner, there'll be a lot of clones. Congratulations if you've got this far in the tutorial. You must be sick of the sound of my voice. I've been editing it as I go along, and I'm sick of the sound of my own voice. But to end, I'm going to talk about the uses of Cloner. And to start with, I'm going to have a breakdown of this. This is a copy of a piece of motion graphics I saw at the cinema. There's an advertising company called Pearl and Dean in the UK, and this is the current animation they have before and after adverts are shown at the cinema. There are probably other ways of doing this, but this is the way I did it. I didn't actually think I was going to have to explain it, so it might be a little disjointed, and there are probably better ways of doing, even with Cloner, some of the things I'm going to show. But it gives you an idea of the sort of things you can do with Cloner. So here we are in Fusion. Here's the flow. It's not that complicated. First thing I'm going to do, you may notice that a lot of these cloners have motion blur. This is to create this blurry effect. But to speed up the viewport, I'm going to turn that off. So now we don't have motion blur on those nodes. So let's begin over here. So obviously we're starting with a background with an ellipse mask to create a circle. That circle is then put in this cloner, which is just a grid cloner of 9 by 1. Could have been done linearly, but it was just easier to just have a grid of, I knew that I wasn't going to adjust the line, so a grid worked fine. And this one, you notice the circles fade in and then fade out. Now this is done with a color effector, which is this, which is just a background with an animated rectangular mask. So the mask comes in and then goes out again. And that's the color effector of this grid. So it fades the circles in and then out. Now you may wonder why I'm using this color effector as opposed to the built-in blend. Well, if you notice, the blend is a very gradual fade from one to the end, whereas I wanted a much harder transition from visible to invisible. So that's why I was using a color effector. And the cloner is this shape because I knew I was going to clone this cloner, because that's one of the techniques of using it. You can animate one thing with one cloner and then clone that in another cloner. We take this cloner and we put it in another cloner, which is here, which is, again, I'm using a grid, a 1 by 5, so it's 5 rows. And if we watch what happened there, you see that each row is mirrored. And the way I did this was just change the angle to 180 degrees. So each clone of the cloner was rotated 180 degrees. And so you get this effect of the animation. And moving on to this merge, this is used to fade in the first of the rings. And I think I'm just using the blend animated to fade in one of the rings. Now this ring, again, we've got a background which has got an ellipse on it, and here's the ellipse. And this is a radial cloner, and there's quite a lot of keyframes on this one, so let's have a look at those. So the radius, I notice there's a keyframe there, is increasing. So there's the radius animated, and then further on it gets animated again. And then the radial offset is done to turn it. Turn it again, and then the radius is animated again off screen. So looking at that merge, this fade in here was just to fade in the beginning of this ring, which is that, on top of this grid of circles, which of course is another cloner. Moving on, we've got another merge, which is another fade in, probably this second circle, which is another radial cloner with various animation. In this case, we're using I am using the blend effect to fade it in as the radius is increasing. Again, it's changing. We're using the radial offset, and then I guess it gets faded out probably by this, by this particular merge node. And again, we've got another similar sort of thing, your radial cloner, which fades in, rotates, the radius shrinks again, so it's back to like a circle. And then this merge is almost certainly the same sort of thing. That's another radial cloner of the circle. Yeah, so basically the combination of those multiple radial cloners, which are all merged together, you get this effect. So looking at the next merge, these are some big circles that expand like that, and that is done using a grid cloner. I may sound surprised because I'm trying to remember how I did this. So it's a grid cloner, and the X size is animated, and then the Y size is animated to create that effect. But there's also, that is merged with just a circle that is doing nothing apart from it shrinks down, which actually is shrinking down because I'm using the same ellipse for the background that I'm cloning here, and this is the center one. So now we look, when they're together, they shrink down at an earlier stage, and that then goes to nothing. So the next stage, we have another merge, which is merging this thing, which is quite a complicated looking thing. So what's happening here? Let's have a look. So that center circle shrinks down, and then another row of circles fades up. And that's done using the blend on this merge. So let's have a look at this circle row. And that is another grid cloner of a circle with a color effector, and that color effector is doing that. So as that fades in, the alpha of each of those circles are being controlled by this color effector. And then, so that creates that. And that's also put in another grid, a grid of 3. So we've got 3 of that. And then that's affected by another color effector, which is doing, that is fading in. So this grid of those rows, the color effector there is changing the vertical fade, and then that's in another grid where the horizontal fade is controlled with this one. So as you see, they sort of fade in and up at the same time. That is then transformed and mirrored, so we get the effect looking like that. That of course is merged with the one from earlier, the first one. I had to look at this again and work out what was happening with this rather complicated setup here, but basically these are various gradients that are animated and then mixed together and merged and then inverted at one point to create different effects at different times. So if we look at this, which is the color effector, we see it starts off as a very thin line, expands, and then shrinks back down again to a single, very thin line in the middle, which is affecting this row. But at the same time, either this ellipse, this background, is this animated? Yeah, this background is animated, so it shrinks. And so if you notice that that one's a solid and there's some very slight transparency there, which is controlled by this color effector. And all of that creates that. And then as you see, the first one fades out, which is probably controlled by this merge. Yep. And then the other ones shrink down because of the scaling of this background. And then there's just another merge, which is the circle, which fades in and then shrinks and then does a bit of a animation to spin it, to sort of fake spin round, which gives the effect. So you can see, even I, who created this, I'm difficult remembering what it all does, but by mixing effectors, gradients, cloning cloners, that sort of thing, you can get some really quite complicated effects. Finally, I'm just going to whiz through very quickly some of the things I've done with Cloner, which might give you some ideas. To be honest, I have no idea what is possible with Cloner. Cloning animations, cloning pictures, cloning video, affecting it with effectors. There's all manner of things that you could create. But these are just some of the things I've done so far. So the first one, we have a grid cloner, which is cloning this circle. In this case, the X and Y right on are being animated, which pulls the clones that way and up, and it's going over a position effector, which is just some text, which has been blurred. So it gives this sort of 3D-ish text effect. And then the right on X is animated, so all the clones go out. And if you notice, the grid size is bigger than 1, so when this writes off, they write off screen completely. This next one is a variation, in fact it's a different version of the previous one. In this case, on the cloner, the X offset is animated over time, but it's set to loop, so the clones are being pushed that way and then coming back round on the other side. But at the same time, the right on X is animated, so it gets wider and wider and wider. At the same time, this text is being used as a scale effector. So if you notice, they are bigger slightly where this text is, and then that text is merged onto an orange background, which is then used as that merge is then used as a color effector to color the clones. And it sort of animates on and off. And then in this case, we're shrinking the Y size as well, and so you get this effect. And I know in this case motion blur isn't on, but on the previous case motion blur was on. And the next one, we have a circle, which is in a grid cloner. And if you watch these right-ons, X and Y, you see that the right on X and then the right on Y, the reveal the grid. Then we are using this fast noise, which is if you notice this is animated, the scale effectors effect is being animated on. So that's affecting the scale. And then the X and Y position of the position effector is animated on. So then they start moving based on that noise. And at the same time, we have this color effector, which animates on the orange, which is affecting the color of all the clones. That fades, and at the same time, the cloner X and Y right on is animated back to that. This next one is very similar to the example I showed. It is a animated circle there, which is then cloned in a grid of 14 by 1. It then has no effectors on it. It's just the time offset of -2. But in this case, I think there's multiple versions of this, which are all very slight variations. And this one isn't using an effector. Yeah, this one's using the effector. When I'm using the cloner, I end up using the versions quite a lot because I come up with an idea that I like the look of, and I don't want to forget how I did it. But you see, this is all based very on the same animation of this offset in time, and then various, if I go to the cloner, various things of the cloner. This effect, a sort of stylized grass, is relatively straightforward. We have a background with a simple polygon mask, is then cloned linearly, then uses this fast noise to scale, or rather shrink down, the grass. It then uses a rotation effector with this animated fast noise to create the animation, or the sort of the rolling of the grass. And then we're using this fast noise, which is static, to color the grass. So using that as a color effector. So you get a sort of slight variation in the greens and yellows of this grass. And finally, we have a radial cloner of a circle with the radial offset animated over time. In this first version, we have some slight blending. So we've got the fade out. And in version 2, that's not blended, but the size is shrunk down very slightly. So you see they're getting smaller and smaller, in fact in both versions. That's then put in another cloner, in this case linear cloner, to get one effect. And then a different version, we have a linear cloner with some variation. In fact, my computer's slowing down because I'm trying to record and do all this at the same time. Another variation, which is a Bezier cloner of that radial cloner. And if I change the version on the actual you get some really quite nice looking graphic effects. So if I just bring up the dual screen, you can see. So this is this Radial Cloner on a Bezier path with a very slight time offset as well. That's a linear one with the scale, so it's like a sort of tunnel. And again, if I change version, you get a completely different effect. I hope that's helpful, and we're interested in seeing what people come up with. If you could put any bug reports in the forum thread on We Suck Less, it'll be helpful to me. If you create anything interesting, maybe link it in the comments below. Thanks a lot.